The blanket hit the floor with a dull thud, its soft folds collapsing into a heap of cotton and lavender scent. For a long moment I couldn't move. My hands stayed frozen on the laundry basket, fingers still damp from the rinse. Across the living room, my daughter-in-law Tasha stood with her arms crossed, chin lifted, like she'd just done me a favor. "This house doesn't need your old woman smell," she said. The words landed sharp and cold, slicing through the quiet. My son Marcus looked up from his phone, hesitated like a man watching a storm he didn't know how to stop. The air in the room thickened until even the ticking clock sounded nervous. I knelt slowly, my knees aching as I reached for the blanket. The scent of detergent and sunshine clung to it, something I'd always found comforting. Today, it felt like humiliation. I folded it carefully, pressing the edges smooth. "I'll keep it out of your way," I said quietly. Tasha rolled her eyes. "Yeah, do that." She walked away, heels clicking against the hardwood like a warning. The sound followed me long after she was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. But by dawn, I knew one thing for sure: she might have thrown my blanket on the floor, but she'd just handed me the lesson she'd never forget. The next morning, I stood by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the fog lift off the Georgia pines. The house smelled of lemon polish and warm toast, a comfort I had built for decades. I'd taught school for 40 years, raised my son here, buried my husband under the oak tree by the back fence. Everything inside these walls carried my fingerprints. The painted cabinet handles the creak of the hallway floor, the maroon drapes I'd sewn myself. Now it felt like a stranger's house. Ever since Marcus lost his job and moved back home with Tasha, the place had been shrinking around me inch by inch. At first I told myself it was temporary, just until he found steady work. I wanted to believe that kindness would be enough to keep the peace. But kindness without respect, I've learned, is an invitation to be stepped on. Tasha strutted around like she was rescuing us, rearranging furniture, changing curtains, filling the air with her perfume that smelled like plastic roses and defiance. She called it modernizing. I called it erasing. That blanket she threw, that was Thomas's blanket, my late husband's. I'd washed it the night before, folded it neat, and left it by the window to dry in the breeze. The scent of lavender always reminded me of his shirts of Sundays when we'd sit on that very couch and watch football. I didn't tell her that, of course. She didn't deserve to know yet. When Marcus came down for breakfast, he looked uneasy. "Mom, about last night," he started, rubbing the back of his neck. I poured his coffee and said nothing. "Tasha didn't mean," he tried again. "I know what she meant," I said, "and I heard her just fine." He sighed, shoulders sagging like a boy who'd disappointed both sides. "Please don't make this harder." I smiled thinly. "Harder, honey, life already did that for me." He didn't answer. Just took his cup and left. I watched him go, wondering how the boy who once cried when he broke my flower vase had become a man afraid to defend his mother. By noon the house was empty. Only Buddy, my old beagle, kept me company. He nudged the blanket with his nose and whimpered softly, as if he too understood what it meant. I set the fabric on my lap, smoothing the wrinkles, and whispered, "It's just us again, old friend." Outside the world glowed green with late spring, but inside something colder had settled. That evening Tasha came home first. Her heels clicked, her laughter echoed from the hallway, sharp and metallic. I was setting the table, 2 plates, one for Marcus, one for her, because lately they'd stopped waiting for me to eat. She walked past without a glance. "Don't bother cooking tonight," she said. "Marcus is bringing takeout." Her tone made it sound like an order, not information. I just nodded, pretending I didn't notice her dropping her purse right on my sewing chair. Every small act was a reminder this wasn't about the blanket. It was about power. She wanted to see how far she could push before I broke. But breaking has never been my style. I've been underestimated before. By parents who thought an old black teacher couldn't handle their restless kids. By men who called me sweetheart instead of ma'am. By grief when it tried to hollow me out after Thomas died. Every time I bent, but I didn't fall. Respect, I learned, isn't something you beg for. It's something you teach quietly, deliberately. After dinner, I sat on the porch with Buddy at my feet, the night humming with cicadas. The moon hung low, pale and calm, like it was listening. I thought about that moment again, the sound of the blanket hitting the floor, the look on her face, smug and careless. I felt the anger rise, but beneath it something steadier bloomed: resolve. Tasha thought I was weak because I didn't shout back. She mistook silence for surrender. But I've lived long enough to know that storms don't always start with thunder. Sometimes they start with stillness. Inside the house, her laughter drifted from the living room. Marcus said something, his voice low, placating. I caught a glimpse of them through the window, her on the couch, him beside her, their faces glowing from the TV light. They looked comfortable, at ease, as if they hadn't crushed something sacred under their feet just the night before. That's when I decided if she wanted to test my patience, I'd let her. But she wouldn't like the lesson when it came. Later that night, I took out my old leather folder, the one labeled Harper Family Trust. It held the documents Thomas and I had signed years ago, back when we dreamed of passing this house down properly. I'd added my own papers. Since then, financial accounts, church donations, the charter for a small community project I'd been nurturing quietly. Respect House, I'd called it, a fund to help widows secure their homes from greedy relatives or landlords. It wasn't big, but it was mine. I ran my finger along the embossed title and smiled faintly. People like Tasha think they're the storm. They forget who built the roof. The next morning I woke early, the kind of early that comes with purpose. The house was still quiet, sunlight painting golden lines across the kitchen counter. I brewed coffee, sliced peaches and fried eggs just the way Marcus liked when he was a boy. When Tasha walked in, hair perfect, robe silky and red, she glanced at the spread like it was an inconvenience. "Smells strong," she muttered, pouring herself coffee without asking. I watched her stir in sugar, the wrong jar of course. She took a sip, grimaced, and spat it into the sink. "Ugh, what the hell is this?" I kept my tone even. "Oh dear," I said softly. "Must have grabbed the wrong jar. Salt looks so much like sugar in the morning light, doesn't it?" Our eyes met, hers, sharp, mine steady. For a second she seemed unsure if I'd done it on purpose. I didn't blink. "Careful next time," she said and turned away. "Always," I replied. When Marcus came down, he sniffed the air and smiled faintly. "Smells like home," he said. I nodded. "It is home, son. Still is." He didn't catch the weight behind my words, but one day he would. Respect begins in silence, but it doesn't end there. That night I folded the blanket one last time and placed it neatly at the foot of my bed. The lavender scent lingered, soft but persistent, like memory itself. "You'd be proud of me, Thomas," I whispered to the dark. "I'm done cleaning up for other people's mess." Outside, a storm was brewing, the kind that rattles windows but clears the air afterward. I smiled as thunder rolled low in the distance. Some lessons, I thought, are best taught when the rain begins to fall. The storm hit just after midnight, heavy and insistent, washing the world clean, while I sat awake on the porch wrapped in Thomas's old blanket. The scent of rain and wet earth filled the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of magnolia. I watched lightning split the sky over the pines, and thought about how storms always seem to know when a woman's patience was running out. Inside, the house creaked and sighed, like it remembered something too. Tasha's voice floated faintly through the cracked window, sharp words, impatient ones. Marcus mumbled a reply. Then silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't mean peace, only exhaustion. Buddy pressed his head against my knee, trembling at the thunder, and I whispered, "It's all right, boy. Let it rain, the house needs it." By morning the storm had passed, but the air still felt thick. I moved through the kitchen quietly, the way I used to before the first day of school, focused, deliberate. The coffee pot hissed, toast popped, and for the first time in days I hummed under my breath. A gospel tune, low and steady, one my mother used to sing when she was tired of people trying her patience. "Lord, don't move my mountain, just give me strength to climb." I didn't hear Tasha come down the stairs until her voice cut through the melody. "Could you not sing so early? Some of us actually need sleep." I turned, wiping my hands on a towel. "Good morning to you too." She rolled her eyes, sliding her phone onto the counter. Marcus said, "You're meeting with some church ladies today. Does that mean I get to have the house to myself?" I smiled, small and calm. "It means the house gets a break, yes." Her lips twitched, ready to fight, but she caught herself. "You really think you can guilt me into being nice, don't you?" "I don't need to guilt anyone," I said softly. Respect isn't forced, it's learned. She let out a short laugh, sharp and empty. You talk like one of those motivational speakers. You know the kind that ends up alone. The words hit, but I didn't flinch. Alone isn't the same as lonely, dear. Her phone buzzed. She looked down, dismissing me like I was background noise. I let her go. She'd learned soon enough that ignoring me didn't mean escaping the lesson. When Marcus came down, I was pouring coffee. He looked tired, his tie crooked, his eyes darting toward the door like he wanted to leave before a fight could start. Mom, he began, rubbing his temple, I need you to try with her. She's under a lot of pressure. I slid the cup toward him. Pressure reveals character, son. It doesn't excuse it. He sighed. I know. But she's my wife. And I'm your mother, I said, calm but firm. This house raised you, fed you, prayed for you. Don't let anyone walk in here and make you forget that. He didn't answer. He just nodded, kissed my cheek, and hurried out into the damp morning. When the door closed, I exhaled slowly. There's a special kind of silence that follows men who leave conflict behind. It's heavy, full of what they didn't say. Later that day, I drove into town for my meeting at the community center. The road curved between rows of pecan trees, their leaves still dripping from the rain. The center sat behind the church, a squat brick building painted the same soft cream as the chapel next door. Inside, the smell of coffee and floor polish mingled with something familiar: sisterhood. Women my age gathered around folding tables, some knitting, others swapping stories about grown children, aching knees, or the latest neighborhood gossip. Lillian called out, Gloria, my oldest friend. You look like you've seen both heaven and hell this week. I smiled and took a seat beside her. Just weathering a new kind of storm. Oh, she raised a brow. You mean that daughter-in-law of yours, the one with the fancy nails and no manners? I chuckled softly. The same. Gloria shook her head. Honey, these young girls think respect is something they can order on Amazon. You can't teach humility to someone who's never been humbled. I sipped my tea, considering her words. Maybe not. But I can make sure she knows where she stands. Not out of spite, out of principle. The women nodded, murmuring in agreement. Reverend May, who'd been listening from the next table, leaned over. Lillian, you've always been steady. Don't let anger harden your heart. Sometimes our lessons work best when they're quiet but firm. I'm not angry, I said, meaning it. Just awake. When I returned home that afternoon, the house smelled faintly of bleach. Tasha had cleaned. My curtains were gone, replaced by thin white ones that looked like hotel sheets. The family photo that once sat on the mantel was gone too. My stomach turned cold. Tasha, I called. In here, her voice came from the living room. She was sitting cross-legged on the couch, scrolling on her phone, a scented candle burning beside her. Where's the picture that was here? She didn't even look up. Oh, that old one, I put it in the closet. It didn't match the new look. New look? She gestured vaguely. The house needed an update. It's too old-fashioned. I stepped closer. That photo was of my husband and me. He built this house with his hands. Finally, she looked up. Then he did a good job. It's still standing, isn't it? Something inside me shifted, something small but final. I walked to the closet, opened it, and saw the frame wedged between boxes, the glass cracked. I held it gently, brushing dust from Thomas's smile. You might not understand this now, I said, turning back to her, but when someone builds something out of love, you don't redecorate it with arrogance. Tasha smirked. You can't control everything, Lillian. Maybe it's time you realized that. I set the frame down carefully. Oh, I know that, dear. I can't control everything. Just what I allow under my roof. She blinked, realizing too late that I wasn't joking. Are you threatening me? Not at all, I said with a smile. I'm promising you. That evening, after she retreated to the guest room and slammed the door, I sat on the porch again. The air was thick with the smell of wet pine and the faint rustle of crickets. I watched lightning flicker far off over the fields, the kind that never reaches you but lets you know the sky's still capable of fire. Buddy rested his head on my lap and I stroked his fur absently. Thomas the First murmured, looking up at the stars, you'd tell me to stay calm. You'd say, kindness always wins. But I think this time, kindness needs a backbone. I rose, went inside, and opened the drawer beside the refrigerator, the one where I kept my papers. Among the recipes and warranty cards sat a slim blue folder labeled Respect House Foundation. I laid it on the table and opened it. There were the forms I'd filed with Pastor Evelyn months ago, when I first dreamed of turning my old home into a safe place for women like me, widows, mothers, grandmothers, anyone who'd been made to feel small. I traced the embossed words on the first page, property in trust until death of founder. I smiled. Tasha didn't know it, but this house wasn't just my home anymore. It was legally bound to something she couldn't touch. From upstairs I heard footsteps, hers and the faint buzz of her voice on the phone. "I can't live like this forever," she whispered to someone. "Once Marcus gets a job, we're out of here." I sat back, let the sound wash over me. It didn't sting anymore. Her leaving wasn't a threat, it was a promise of peace. Before going to bed, I wrote a single sentence in my journal: "Some lessons can't be spoken. They have to be lived until they echo." The storm outside had long since passed, but as I turned off the lamp I could still hear the rainwater dripping from the eaves, steady, patient cleansing. I smiled to the darkness. Tomorrow, I decided she'd wake up to a house that finally remembered who it belonged to. The sun was barely up when I woke to the sound of drawers opening and closing down the hall. The clatter of hangers and the faint hum of Tasha's voice leaked through the thin walls. I took a deep breath, smelled the faint trace of coffee already brewing, and knew she was making herself comfortable again. I sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness from my back, then reached for the folded blanket at the foot of the bed. I brushed my hand over its soft wool, still faintly scented with lavender. "You survived worse," I whispered to it as though it could hear. The morning light broke through the curtains and landed across the floorboards. Thomas had installed himself 40 years ago. They'd outlasted everything: storms, grief, even foolish pride. Maybe I could too. In the kitchen, the radio played low jazz. Tasha stood at the counter in one of my aprons, scrolling her phone with one hand, stirring a pot with the other. The sight stopped me cold. My apron, the floral one Thomas gave me on our 20th anniversary, looked like a costume on her. She glanced up. "Oh," she said, not smiling. "You're up early." "I usually am," I said. "Old habits die hard." "Well, I thought I'd handle breakfast," she said, dropping slices of bacon into a pan. "You don't have to hover." "Okay." I walked to the cupboard, pulled out my mug, and poured coffee. "I wasn't planning to," I said, taking a sip. "But you might want to turn the heat down before you set off the smoke alarm." She frowned at the pan. "I know how to cook, Lillian." "Of course you do," I said gently. "Just differently." She huffed. "That's one way to put it." I leaned against the counter and watched her struggle with the bacon curling and popping in the oil. She cursed softly under her breath and I almost smiled. There was something poetic about it, her trying to master a kitchen that had never welcomed her. The smell of burning oil began to fill the room. "I told you," I murmured. She turned sharply, eyes flashing. "Do you always have to have the last word?" "No," I said, setting down my cup. "But I always make sure the truth gets one." The pan hissed louder. She grabbed a towel, yanked it off the stove, and dropped it in the sink. Smoke curled up gray and stubborn. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without looking at me, she said, "Marcus said, you've been working on some charity thing. Respect House or something." I blinked, caught off guard. "He mentioned that." "Yeah," she said, rinsing the pan. "He said you're turning this place into some kind of women's project. You planning to kick us out to make room?" I folded my arms. "That's not what it is. It's a foundation. To protect women, especially older women who've lost control of their homes." She turned off the tap, drying her hands slowly. "And what's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've seen too many women pushed out of their own houses because somebody younger decided they didn't belong anymore." Her expression flickered, the faintest trace of guilt, or maybe realization. "You think that's me?" I met her gaze. "I think if the shoe fits, you might want to look at why." Her jaw clenched, and for a heartbeat I saw something raw behind her anger. Then she smiled, all sharp edges again. "You really are something else." "So I've been told," I said, picking up my mug. "By people who thought they could outlast me." When Marcus came down, the tension in the room was thick enough to slice. He rubbed his hands together. "Smells smoky," he said. "Everything okay in here?" Tasha forced a smile. "Just learning from the master." She glanced at me, then back at him. Your mom has opinions. Always has, he said, chuckling nervously. That's kind of her thing. It's called standards, I said. You learn them, or you live without them. Marcus sighed. Can we not start the day like this? I smiled sweetly. I already started mine hours ago. You're just catching up. He groaned, kissed Tasha on the temple, and muttered something about work. I watched him go the tension, leaving with him like air from a balloon. When the door closed, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was waiting. Tasha turned to me. You know Marcus feels caught in the middle. You keep pushing him like this and he'll snap. He's a grown man, I said. If he snaps, that's his choice. But you don't get to hide behind him when you break things. Break things, she repeated. Like what? Respect, I said simply. She opened her mouth to argue but then stopped. Her face softened for just a second before hardening again. You act like I'm the only one with problems here, she said. I lost my job too, you know. We moved in because we didn't have a choice. Maybe I don't handle things like you, but I'm trying. I set my cup down. Trying doesn't mean stepping on the person who gave you a place to land. Her eyes dropped. For the first time, she didn't have an answer. I almost pitied her, almost. By afternoon, Marcus had called to say he'd gotten a short-term job at a construction company. I was genuinely happy for him. When he got home sweaty and smiling, I met him on the porch with sweet tea. See, I said, handing him the glass. Storms don't last forever. He grinned. Thanks, Mom. Maybe this'll give Tasha and me a chance to get back on track. Maybe, I said. Just remember who steadied the roof when the wind hit. He laughed, not understanding the double meaning, and went inside. I stayed on the porch watching the sunlight slip through the branches, thinking of how quickly storms could return. That evening I caught Tasha in the living room, with boxes spread across the table. What's all this? I asked. She looked up, startled. Just sorting stuff. Marcus said we should start clearing space. For what? She hesitated. Maybe turning that spare room into an office for him. Or, for me if I get my remote job back. That spare room has Thomas's things, I said quietly. You can clear space without erasing memories. She sighed dramatically. You act like I'm stealing ghosts. I stepped closer. Those ghosts built your shelter. Her face tightened. You think you own everything in this house, don't you? I know what I've paid for, I said evenly. With money, time, and patience. She slammed a box shut. Well, maybe you should start paying attention to the future instead of living in the past. I am, I said. That's why I made sure this house will still stand when respect doesn't. She looked at me sharply. What does that mean? I smiled faintly. You'll find out soon enough. That night, after everyone went to bed, I walked through the house slowly. I touched the smooth banister Thomas carved by hand, the kitchen counter he sanded until it shone. Each mark was a memory, each corner a story. Tasha thought she could replace it all with scented candles and bright curtains, but she didn't understand the house itself remembered. The walls held echoes of laughter, grief, forgiveness, and strength. They knew who belonged and who didn't. I paused by the window where the blanket had once rested, before she threw it on the floor. The moonlight spilled across the fabric, now lying folded on the armchair. I picked it up, breathed in the faint lavender, and smiled to myself. She thought she'd insulted me that night, but she'd only reminded me what I stood for. Respect doesn't vanish when someone throws it away, it just waits to be reclaimed. I sat down in Thomas's old chair, Buddy curling at my feet, and opened my journal. My handwriting trembled slightly, but the words came steady. Today she revealed her fear. People like Tasha act cruel when they feel powerless. But fear doesn't excuse cruelty. It only warns you where the cracks are. I closed the book and looked around at the house, glowing softly under the moonlight. You're safe, I whispered. For now. Somewhere upstairs, I heard her pacing, muttering on the phone. I couldn't make out the words, but her tone was sharp, urgent. It didn't matter. Whatever schemes she was building, she didn't know the ground she was standing on had already been secured by me, by Thomas, by every woman before us who refused to be erased. Outside, a breeze swept through the magnolias, carrying the faint scent of rain again. I smiled, leaning back in the chair. Let it come, I murmured. Every storm has its purpose. The smell of fresh paint hit me before I even stepped inside. I stood in the doorway, keys still in my hand, staring at the pale gray walls that had replaced the warm yellow Thomas and I had chosen together 40 years ago. My stomach tightened. I could almost hear his voice again, laughing as he rolled paint over the old plaster, saying, "This color feels like sunlight, Lil. Like home." Now it looked like a rental house, cold, empty, someone else's dream. I set my purse down carefully, fighting the tremor in my hands. "Tasha," I called out. She appeared from the hallway, ponytail high, wearing paint-stained leggings and a tank top. "Hey," she said brightly, too brightly. "You like it? I wanted to surprise you." "You certainly did," I said quietly, looking around. The curtains were gone too. My lace ones, hand-sewn by my sister before she passed, replaced by sheer white panels that hung like ghosts. "What happened to the yellow?" "It was dated," she said, shrugging. "Gray's cleaner. More modern." "Don't you think I ran a hand over the smooth wall, the color too cold against my fingers?" "Modern isn't always better." She smiled like she was humoring a child. "I guess that depends on who you ask." The sound of Marcus's car pulling up in the driveway made us both pause. He came in holding a grocery bag and stopped mid-step. "Whoa. You actually did it." "Doesn't it look great?" Tasha said, wiping sweat from her forehead. He glanced at me. "Mom," I forced a small smile. "It's different." "She's not a fan," Tasha said, quickly turning away. "I didn't say that," I replied. "I just said different." But my voice gave me away and we all heard it. Marcus exhaled, rubbing his temple. "We'll talk about it later," he muttered, walking past us toward the kitchen. Tasha followed him, and I stood there alone in the half-finished room, the smell of fresh paint pressing against my chest. I wanted to scream to demand my color back, but I'd learned long ago that shouting only gives away your power. Instead, I whispered to the walls, "You still remember, don't you, what this house really is?" That evening, the sky bruised into shades of purple and blue as rain threatened again. I stood by the window, watching clouds roll over the treetops. Marcus sat on the couch, eyes tired, scrolling his phone. Tasha had retreated upstairs, humming to herself as she unpacked boxes. The air between us was heavy. "She didn't mean to upset you," Marcus said finally, without looking up. "She painted over your father's memory," I said. He sighed. "Mom, it's just paint." "No, son. It's never just paint." I turned to him. "It's what it meant." "She didn't ask. She just took." He looked up, eyes pleading. "She's trying to make this house feel like home for her too." I folded my arms. It already was a home. She just doesn't know how to live in one. He stood frustrated, running a hand through his hair. "You both are impossible." I smiled sadly. "No, son. Just different generations of women who've had to fight too hard to be understood." He didn't reply, just grabbed his jacket and went out onto the porch, letting the screen door slam behind him. The echo lingered long after he'd gone. When I went upstairs later, I found the hallway cluttered with boxes labeled storage. My heart sank when I saw one marked Henry's Tools. I knelt down, opened the flap and found his old hammer and wrenches inside, neatly packed but covered in dust. Tasha, the first called voice, sharper than I intended. She appeared at the top of the stairs, holding her phone. "What now? Why are my husband's things boxed up?" She frowned. "They smelled of oil and mildew. I figured you wouldn't mind. I moved them to the attic." "You moved them," I repeated slowly. "Yes," she said. "You should thank me. The closet's cleaner now." I stood, gripping the edge of the box. "You don't touch what you didn't build." Her tone turned mocking. "God, you're dramatic. They're just tools." I looked her dead in the eye. "No, they're history. And one day when you lose someone you love, you'll understand that." She rolled her eyes. "Please, spare me the lecture." I set the box down and took a slow breath. "Tasha, this is my house. You are a guest here. A guest does not decide which memories get to stay." She crossed her arms. "A guest, wow. You really want me gone, don't you?" I met her stare evenly. "I want peace. You decide what that looks like." Her lips trembled for a second before she hid it with a smirk. "Peace is boring anyway." I turned and walked away before my temper did something my dignity couldn't repair. That night, I sat by my window again, the rain finally coming down steady. Buddy curled at my feet, snoring softly. The house felt restless, like it was shifting under my skin. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in the rhythm of the drops against the glass. "Don't let her take your peace, Lil. Protect what's yours." Downstairs, I heard the faint scrape of wood, Tasha, moving furniture again. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to breathe. I'd already planned my next step, quiet but certain. Tomorrow she'd see just how deeply my roots ran. In the morning, I rose early. The sky was soft pink, the kind of color Thomas used to call forgiving light. I brewed coffee, fed Buddy, and opened my leather folder on the kitchen table. Inside was every paper tied to the house, the trust documents, the signatures, the deed. I checked each page carefully. Everything still intact. Everything still mine. By the time Tasha came down, I had already finished breakfast. She looked surprised to see me smiling. "Morning," she said cautiously. "Morning, dear," I replied sweetly. "Sleep well." "Fine," she said, grabbing a cup. "You're in a good mood." "It's a good day," I said. "You'll see." She glanced at me warily. "You sound scary when you're cheerful." Then I must be doing something right. Marcus came down moments later, Ty half nodded, distracted as usual. "I've got an early shift," he said. "Don't wait up." "Be safe," I said, kissing his cheek. Once he left, I turned back to Tasha. "I'll be out for a few hours." "Church errands." She waved a hand. "Sure. Whatever." I drove straight to the office of Pastor Evelyn, who'd helped me draft the trust years ago. The church sat quiet in the morning haze, sunlight catching on the stained glass windows. Evelyn greeted me with her usual warm smile. "Lillian Harper," she said. "I was wondering when you'd stop by again." "I think it's time," I said, setting my folder on her desk. To activate the second clause, her smile faded. "You're sure, more sure than ever." She opened the folder, scanning the documents. "This will make it official. The house will belong solely to the foundation. You'll remain as life occupant, but no one, not even family, can alter ownership or sell it." "That's the point," I said quietly. "It's protection, not punishment." Evelyn nodded. "Then let's make it happen." We signed the papers together. The pen felt heavy in my hand, but when I lifted it, I felt something lighter than I had in months. On my way home, the radio played an old gospel song, "I Shall Not Be Moved." The lyrics filled the car like a prayer. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as ever, but I knew better. Now it stood on ground no one could shake. Inside, Tasha was rearranging the living room again, dragging Thomas's old armchair toward the window. She looked up when she saw me. "Oh, you're back." "I was just making space." I set my purse down and smiled softly. "That's fine, just don't move the chair too far." She frowned. "Why not?" "Because that's where it belongs," I said simply. "And so do I." She tilted her head, confused by my tone. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing you need to worry about," I said, pouring myself a cup of tea. "For now." When I sat down, the chair creaked beneath me, a sound that felt like the house itself breathing easier. The sunlight caught the silver threads of the blanket folded beside me, and I smiled, stroking its edge. The game had changed, even if Tasha didn't know it yet. Respect wasn't something I'd be begging for anymore. It was something I'd built quietly, legally, permanently. And one day soon she'd realize just how unshakable an old woman's house could be. The letter came 2 days later, tucked neatly into the mailbox between a grocery flyer and a church bulletin. The envelope was cream-colored, the kind used by lawyers, with my name typed clean and precise on the front, Mrs. Lillian Harper. My stomach tightened before I even opened it. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it while the coffee brewed. The house was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and Buddy's paws shifting across the floor. Finally, I took a deep breath and slid my finger under the seal. Inside was a copy of the finalized deed transfer, Legacy House Foundation, full activation. The words looked both ordinary and monumental. I ran my fingers over the embossed stamp, the ink still smelling faintly of permanence. The house was no longer legally mine, at least not in the way Tasha or Marcus would understand. It belonged to something larger now, something incorruptible. I smiled softly. "You're safe, old friend," I whispered to the walls. "No one's taking you from me again." By the time Tasha came down, the letter was folded back into the envelope, resting on the counter beside my mug. She breezed into the kitchen wearing Marcus's shirt and a cloud of perfume that didn't belong to this house. "Morning," she said, already scrolling her phone. "Morning," I replied, calm as a lake. "Coffee's fresh." She poured herself a cup, took a sip, and grimaced. "Still too strong. You like everything bitter, don't you?" I smiled faintly. "Just learned to taste what life gives me." Her eyes flicked up suspicious. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing at all," I said, taking my mug and walking to the porch. "Enjoy your morning." She didn't reply, but I could feel her glare follow me through the doorway. Outside the air was heavy with humidity, the sky stretching wide and bright over the pines. I sat in Thomas's old chair, the envelope still in my lap, and felt a peace I hadn't known in months. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. Later that afternoon, Marcus came home earlier than usual. His face was sunburned from work, shirt damp with sweat, but there was light in his eyes again. "Got hired full-time," he said, beaming. "They like me, Mom. Said I might be supervisor by summer." I grinned, pulling him into a hug. "See, hard work still pays off." "Yeah," he said. "Maybe things will finally calm down around here." From the hallway, Tasha's voice floated in dry and sharp. "Don't count on it." Marcus turned frowning. "Tasha," she walked into the kitchen, arms crossed. "You didn't tell me you were staying late yesterday. I cooked dinner and you never showed up." He blinked. "I called you. I didn't get it, because you blocked my number again," he muttered under his breath. I busied myself at the sink, trying to stay out of it, but their voices rose like two storms colliding. "Don't start this, Marcus. I'm not starting anything. You're just like your mother, always making me the villain." That was enough. I turned, voice steady. "Leave me out of your marriage, Tasha. If you two want to argue, do it without dragging my name through the mud." She shot me a glare. "It's hard not to when you're always in the middle of it." I folded the dish towel carefully. "This is my house. I'm in the middle by default." Marcus stepped between us. "Enough, both of you." The silence that followed was thick and brittle. I could see the shame flicker in his eyes. He kissed my forehead, muttered, "I'll fix this," and walked out onto the porch. The door slammed behind him. Tasha stared at me for a long time. Her expression softened, but her voice didn't. "You really don't see how you twist him around, do you? He's drowning between us." "I raised him to swim," I said. "If he's drowning, it's because someone keeps pulling him under." She blinked, her jaw tightening. "You're unbelievable." "Maybe," I said, "but I'm not wrong." She turned on her heel and stormed upstairs. Buddy trotted after her, whining as the door slammed. I sighed, rubbing my temples. The house had always been full of sound, laughter, music, prayer, but lately it only echoed anger. I couldn't stand it much longer. That night, rain began again, soft at first, then steady. I sat in my chair by the window with the old blanket across my knees. The moonlight silvered the garden, making the wet leaves glow. I thought of all the women I'd met at the church, those who'd been pushed out of their own homes by ungrateful children, manipulative in-laws, greedy cousins. I remembered the trembling voice of one widow who'd lost everything after her daughter convinced her to sign the papers for safety. She ended up in a nursing home, her house sold for profit. I'd promised myself that would never happen to me. Tonight that promise felt stronger than ever. I heard footsteps in the hallway and looked up. Tasha stood there in her robe, arms crossed, eyes shadowed. "You still awake?" she asked. "I could ask you the same." She hesitated, then sat across from me. The rain filled the silence between us. Finally she said, "Marcus thinks I hate you." "Do you?" Her jaw tightened. "I don't know. You make it easy too sometimes." I folded my hands. "And yet here you are, sitting with me instead of him." She looked down at her hands. "He's not listening anymore. To me, to anyone. He's so caught between trying to please you and fixing us that he's losing himself." "You think this is about him," I said quietly. "But it's not. It's about respect. For the house. For me. For the man he's trying to be." She met my gaze. "You really think you know everything, don't you?" "No," I said softly. "I just know what losing respect looks like." She laughed bitterly. "You mean like me losing mine?" "Like me almost losing mine," I corrected. "But I learned to stand up again. Maybe you can too." For a moment something flickered in her eyes, hurt, or maybe understanding, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "Good night, Lillian," she said, standing up. Good night, Tasha. After she left, I sat there for a long while listening to the steady rhythm of the rain. I didn't hate her. I pitied her. She was too young to understand that pride was just fear in fancy clothes. But soon she would learn. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, catching on the clean floors. I brewed a fresh pot of coffee, humming to myself. When Tasha came down, she looked wary, almost cautious. "You're in a good mood," she said. "I decided it's a fine day to be alive," I replied. She poured herself a cup. "Well, enjoy it while it lasts." "I plan to," I said. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Tasha frowned. "Who's that this early?" I opened it and found Mr. Harris, my neighbor and attorney, standing there with a briefcase. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," he said cheerfully. "I just wanted to drop off your copy of the trust papers. Everything's finalized." I smiled. "Perfect timing, Mr. Harris, thank you." Tasha's brow furrowed. "Trust papers? What trust papers?" "Just business," I said smoothly, taking the folder. "You can go finish your coffee." But she didn't move. "What kind of business, Mr. Harris?" Ever the professional nodded politely to her. "Foundation matters." "Have a good day, ma'am." He tipped his hat and left. When I turned back, Tasha was still staring. "You're hiding something," she said. I smiled faintly. "I'm protecting something." She crossed her arms. "Same thing, isn't it?" "Not at all," I said, walking past her. "One comes from fear, the other from wisdom." As I placed the folder carefully in the drawer, I could feel her eyes burning into my back. She didn't know it yet, but the ground beneath her had already shifted. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat again by the window with my journal. I wrote slowly, the pen gliding over the page. "She's starting to sense the walls closing in, but she doesn't know they're built from my peace, not my anger." Buddy sighed at my feet, the house quiet except for the creak of settling wood. Outside, the sky turned gold, then crimson. "Almost time," I whispered. "Almost." By the time dawn broke, I already knew the day would test me. The air hung heavy, and still, that strange stillness that comes before a storm, not the kind that pours from the sky, but the kind that starts in people. I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching fog drift through the trees. The house behind me was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the hush of something waiting to explode. When I went back inside, I found Tasha standing in the hallway with a man I didn't recognize. He wore a pressed shirt and carried a clipboard. "Morning," I said, setting my cup down. "Can I help you?" The man smiled nervously. "Mrs. Harper, I'm with Low Country Realty. I'm here to take measurements for the appraisal." "The what appraisal?" he repeated. "For the property. Mrs. Tasha Harper scheduled it." Tasha froze, caught mid-step. "It's not a big deal," she said quickly. "I just wanted to get a sense of the market value. You know, information." I took a slow breath, feeling the air leave my lungs like smoke. "Information," I echoed. "And what exactly would you do with that information?" She opened her mouth, but I cut her off with a raised hand. "You can measure the yard if you'd like," I said to the man. "But if you step 1 foot inside this house, I'll call the police for trespassing." His eyes widened. Yes, ma'am." He turned to Tasha, uncertain. "Outside only," I said, voice calm, unshakable. "The porch, the yard, and the property line. That's where your job begins and ends." He hesitated, then gave a small nod and hurried outside. The moment he was gone, Tasha's mask cracked. "You didn't have to humiliate me like that." "Humiliate you?" I said quietly. "You invited a stranger to measure a home that isn't yours. That's not initiative, Tasha. That's audacity." Her face flushed. "Marcus said." "Marcus doesn't know about this, does he?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She bit her lip and looked away. "That's what I thought," I said. "If you're planning to sell something, at least make sure you own it first." "You think you can just control everything," she snapped. "You act like this house is a throne and you're the queen sitting on it." I smiled faintly. "Queens don't ask permission in their own homes, dear. They simply rule." She glared at me, trembling with anger. "You think you've won. You haven't. I'll find a way out of this." I turned to leave. "Then you'd better start walking, because you're not going to find it here." When Marcus came home that evening, he could tell something had shifted. He set down his briefcase and glanced between us. "What happened now? Ask your wife," I said. Tasha's arms folded tight across her chest. Your mother embarrassed me in front of a realtor. She treated me like a criminal. Marcus's brow furrowed. A realtor, she was just getting an appraisal, I said simply. For the house. He turned to her slowly. I was curious, she said defensively. You keep talking about moving one day, starting over, and I just wanted to be prepared. Prepared, Marcus repeated. Prepared to sell my mother's home without telling me. She took a step toward him. Don't make this about loyalty, Marcus. This isn't your house either. We're living here for free. His face darkened. Don't talk about this place like it's charity. It's home. At least it was. Tasha's voice cracked. You always take her side. He closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. Because she's right. For a moment the house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Tasha grabbed her purse and stormed upstairs. The door slammed, shaking the picture frames on the wall. Marcus looked at me weary. She's out of control. She's scared, I said softly. People act out when they feel cornered. He sat at the table, rubbing his temples. I'm just tired, Mom. Of all of it. I placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't have to carry both our storms, son. She'll have to face what she's done. That night, I walked through the house checking the locks and turning off the lights. The air still felt charged, like the tension itself was electric. Upstairs I heard muffled crying, Tasha's voice broken and small. I hesitated outside her door listening. For a second pity tugged at me. But pity, I reminded myself, can make fools of wise women. I turned away. In the morning she was gone. Her car keys missing from the hook, a half-empty suitcase left on the couch. Marcus called her 3 times before she answered. I could hear her voice through the speaker, cool and composed now. I just need space, she said. Don't worry. I'll be back when I figure things out. Marcus's eyes darted to me. You drove her out. She walked out, I corrected. On her own 2 feet. She wouldn't have if you'd just what I asked, meeting his gaze. Let her turn this house into something unrecognizable. Let her erase what we built. He shook his head. You two are going to destroy each other. No, I said quietly. Only one of us is self-destructing. He left the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed like thunder rolling down an empty road. The house was quiet for 3 days. I spent the time cleaning, cooking, and restoring what she'd tried to change. The blue curtains went back up. The photo of Thomas returned to the mantel. The walls still held that dull gray color, but I could live with that. Paint can't kill memory. On the 4th morning, a knock came at the door. When I opened it, Tasha stood there. She looked different, paler, exhausted, her hair pulled back carelessly. May I come in? She asked. I stepped aside. It's still your home for now. She walked past me, setting her purse on the table. I stayed at my sister's. I just needed to think. Did you? She nodded, staring at her hands. I was wrong about the appraisal. I shouldn't have done that. I waited. She swallowed hard. I don't hate you, Lillian. I just don't know how to exist around you. You're unshakable. It's intimidating. Respect can feel that way to people who've never practiced it, I said gently. She looked up, eyes glossy. You think I'm some spoiled brat who doesn't know how to love. Maybe you're right. But I didn't grow up with this. She gestured around the house, this kind of steadiness. I don't know how to live in it. Something in her voice cracked open a small door inside me. Steadiness isn't comfort, Tasha. It's survival. You learn it by losing everything you thought you could control. She blinked. Like you did, exactly like I did. The rain began again outside, tapping softly on the porch roof. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm not going anywhere. Not until I fix what I broke. I nodded. That's a start. When Marcus came home that evening, he found us in the kitchen, me stirring soup, Tasha slicing bread beside me. He froze in the doorway. You two cooking together, should I be scared? I smiled, just hungry. Tasha looked at him and managed a small smile. I told her I'd make peace. She said soup was a good place to start. He chuckled, the tension easing from his shoulders. Then, let's eat. As we sat at the table, the storm outside grew heavier. The rain battered the windows, lightning flashing in the distance. But for the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel fragile. It felt alive. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the lights dimmed, I stood by the window watching the rain. Tasha came to stand beside me. You were right, she said softly. About fear. It makes people cruel. And about forgiveness, I added. It makes people brave. She glanced at me, uncertain. Are we brave now? I smiled faintly. We're learning. Thunder rolled low, shaking the ground beneath us. Buddy barked once, then settled. I touched the glass, feeling the cool condensation against my fingertips. The storm raged, but I wasn't afraid. Some storms come to destroy, but others come to clear the air. Tonight I could feel which kind this was. The morning after the storm felt different, lighter somehow, as if the air itself had exhaled. The house was filled with that quiet scent of rain-soaked earth and lemon soap. I moved through the kitchen barefoot, humming softly as I wiped down the counters. For the first time in weeks, the floor didn't creak with tension. From the hallway I could hear Tasha's voice, low calm, talking to someone on the phone. Her tone wasn't sharp, not defensive, just tired. Progress, I thought, small but real. Marcus came in wearing his work jacket, the scent of fresh-cut wood clinging to him. You're up early, he said, grabbing a biscuit from the plate. Habit, I said. Peaceful mornings are too rare to waste. He smiled faintly. Feels like we finally caught one, huh? I nodded. Don't jinx it. He kissed my cheek and headed out. When the door closed, I stood for a moment soaking in the stillness. Then Tasha appeared, her hair damp from the shower, wearing a simple gray sweater. No jewelry, no perfume, just her. Morning, she said. Morning, I replied, pouring her a cup of coffee. No realtor visits today, her lips curved, just barely. No ma'am. I think I've caused enough chaos for one lifetime. That's a start, I said, handing her the mug. She took a sip, grimaced slightly, then smiled. Still too strong. You'll get used to it. For a while we stood in quiet company, the kind that used to feel impossible between us. Then she cleared her throat. I've been thinking about that foundation of yours, the one you started for women. I looked up. Respect House. Right, she said, nodding. You said it's supposed to help widows keep their homes right, and women at risk of losing them, I said. Why? She hesitated. I want to help. Maybe volunteer. I've been looking at my resume and, I don't know. I want to do something that matters. Her voice was soft, almost unsure, and for the first time I saw the girl beneath the arrogance. I studied her for a moment. Helping others is the easy part, I said. Helping yourself takes more work. I'm trying to do both, she said quietly. I nodded. Then we'll start small. The community center's hosting a donation drive this weekend. You can come with me. Her eyes widened slightly. You'd let me? Helping doesn't need permission, I said. Only sincerity. Later that afternoon, I took her into town with me. The drive was quiet but not tense. The roads glistened with leftover rain, and the sunlight broke through the trees in scattered beams. I could see her reflection in the window, pensive, not defensive. When we pulled up to the community center, she exhaled slowly. I haven't been here since Marcus and I got married. It feels smaller. Things always shrink when you stop looking at them with gratitude, I said. Inside, the smell of coffee and fresh paper filled the room. Reverend May greeted us at the door, her wide smile as warm as always. Well, praise the Lord if it isn't Lillian Harper, she said, hugging me tight. And who's this young lady? This is my daughter-in-law, Tasha, I said. She's here to help. Reverend May raised an eyebrow. Is she now? Bless her heart. We always need another pair of hands. Tasha smiled shyly. Happy to be here. For the next few hours we worked side by side, sorting clothes, labeling food donations, and folding flyers for the upcoming fundraiser. The room buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the clatter of boxes being moved. Every now and then I'd glance over at Tasha. She wasn't scrolling through her phone or sighing impatiently. She was working, focused, present. At one point, an older woman named Mrs. Delaney came up to our table. Her hands trembled as she filled out a form. They said you help women who've lost their homes, she said softly. My son, he's trying to get me into assisted living, but I don't want to go. My husband built our house. I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. We'll make sure no one takes what's yours. Mrs. Delaney smiled weakly, her eyes glistening. You sound like someone who's been through it. Before I could answer, Tasha spoke. She has, she said quietly. But she didn't let it break her. I turned to her surprised. She didn't meet my eyes, but the sincerity in her voice was undeniable. Mrs. Delaney nodded. Then I'll try to be brave like her. By the time the drive ended, the sun had dipped low, painting everything in honey and gold. As we loaded the last boxes into my trunk, Tasha sighed, wiping sweat from her forehead. I didn't realize helping could feel this good, she said. That's because it's the only kind of work that lasts, I said. On the ride home, she was quiet again, but it was a thoughtful quiet. When we pulled into the driveway, she turned to me. You really think people like me can change? I smiled. Everyone can change, Tasha. Some just need to be reminded they're capable of it. That night after dinner, Marcus found us sitting together on the porch. He looked around, blinking in disbelief. Are you two actually getting along? Tasha chuckled softly. Miracles happen. He grinned. Guess I picked the right week to stop worrying. Don't stop just yet, I said, laughing. We're still learning. He kissed Tasha on the forehead and went inside humming. For a while the two of us sat there listening to the chorus of crickets. The air smelled of damp wood and blooming jasmine. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. I looked over. For what? For the blanket, she said, voice trembling slightly. And the paint, and the way I talked to you. I let the silence sit for a moment before replying. You can't unspill the stew, Tasha, but you can clean the floor. That's what you're doing now. Her eyes filled, but she smiled. You always have a way of turning everything into a proverb. I laughed softly. It comes with age. And patience. She looked down, fidgeting with her sleeve. I didn't hate you, you know. I was jealous. You built something I never had: family, respect, purpose. I didn't know how to fit into that. You don't fit into it, I said gently. You add to it, if you choose to. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time she looked at me without pride, without defensiveness, just honesty. Then I choose to. I reached out, placed my hand over hers, and gave it a soft squeeze. Good. Because this house isn't built on grudges. It's built on lessons. And you're part of it now. Inside the clock chimed 9. The sound echoed through the quiet hall like a heartbeat. Buddy stretched at our feet, yawning. Tasha leaned back in her chair, looking out into the dark yard. You know, she said, I used to think strength meant getting your way. Now I think it means knowing when to stop fighting. I smiled. That's wisdom most people never learn. The night deepened, crickets grew louder, and somewhere far away thunder rumbled, faintly soft, distant but familiar. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. Storm's not done yet, I murmured. Tasha glanced over. Another one coming, always, I said, but this time we'll be ready. We sat there together under the porch light, two women who'd once been enemies, now sharing the same silence, the same air. The world beyond the yard shimmered with dew and possibility. And for the first time I felt something I hadn't in years: hope that the lessons I'd learned the hard way might finally be teaching someone else. The air smelled of sunshine and sawdust when Marcus backed his truck into the driveway that Saturday morning. He jumped out with a grin, his shirt damp with sweat and paint on his jeans. Got a surprise for you, Mom, he called. I stepped out onto the porch, shielding my eyes from the glare. The truck bed was piled high with lumber, paint cans, and flower boxes. What's all this? I asked. He clapped his hands together. A new porch railing. Figured it's time to fix the old one. I smiled, my heart tugging in that quiet way only a mother's can. Your father would approve, I said. Just make sure it's straight this time. Tasha appeared behind him carrying a tray of lemonade. And I brought the fuel, she said, flashing a smile that no longer looked forced. Figured we could make a day of it. A Harper family project, I said softly. Haven't had one of those in years. The three of us spent the morning outside, the sun warming our backs as we worked. Marcus measured, sawed, and hammered with steady hands, while Tasha sanded and painted. I trimmed the lavender beds nearby, humming a tune that floated above the clatter of nails and laughter. It felt good, normal. Like the world had finally remembered how to be kind again. By noon we took a break on the steps. Tasha handed me a glass of lemonade. You know, she said, I used to hate this kind of thing. Working outside, sweating for hours. But there's something about building something with your hands that hits different. I nodded. You don't just build things with your hands, Tasha. You rebuild yourself. She smiled faintly. Then I guess I'm still under construction. Buddy trotted over and rested his head on her knee, tail wagging. Looks like someone forgave you already, I teased. She laughed, scratching behind his ears. Guess he's quicker than I am. That afternoon, Marcus ran into town to pick up extra nails, leaving Tasha and me alone in the soft quiet of the porch. The cicadas buzzed lazily in the trees. She set down her paintbrush and leaned back against the railing. I never told you, she said after a while, but when we first moved in, I hated this house. I didn't answer, just waited. I thought it was suffocating, she continued. Like every wall had eyes judging me. I wanted to change everything so it would stop feeling like your house and start feeling like mine. But I get it now. It was never the walls that judged me, it was me. I watched her face as she spoke, saw the honesty there, the rawness. We all start by trying to change what we don't understand, I said. The trick is learning to listen to what it's trying to teach us. She looked out across the yard, her eyes soft. You ever miss him, Thomas? I mean, every day, I said. But I don't carry it like I used to. Grief's like water, you can drown in it or you can learn to float. She nodded slowly. You really built this place on love, didn't you? Yes, I said quietly. And on forgiveness. Both take work. For a long while we didn't talk. We just sat there, two women sharing silence the way others might share bread. I could feel the tension that had once poisoned the air between us dissolving, replaced by something fragile but real. Marcus returned later with the nails, and the three of us finished the railing just before sunset. When it was done, I stood back and looked at it, solid, clean, sturdy as truth itself. Looks good, I said. Better than good, Marcus replied. It's strong. Tasha wiped her hands on her jeans. We should carve something into it, like initials or a quote. I laughed. You don't strike me as sentimental. I'm learning from the best, she said with a wink. Marcus chuckled. Go on then, what should it say? I thought for a moment, then smiled. Respect builds stronger than nails. He grinned. Perfect. Tasha used the tip of a screwdriver to scratch the words gently into the fresh wood. I watched as the letters took shape, sunlight glinting off the metal. When she finished, she traced them once more with her fingertip. There, she said. Permanent. After dinner, Marcus fell asleep on the couch, Buddy snoring beside him. Tasha and I washed the dishes together, our movements falling into a quiet rhythm. She dried the plates while I stacked them in the cupboard. You know, she said softly, when I was little, my mother used to say, respect is something you earn. But I think she was wrong. I glanced at her. Oh, I think respect is something you practice. Every day, until it becomes who you are. I smiled. That's a lesson some people never learn, but you're getting there. She looked down, a small smile playing at her lips. You really think so? I do, I said. You're proving it. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the house, turning off lights. The air was still peaceful. I stopped by the living room, where the new railing glowed faintly under the porch light outside. The carved words caught my eye. Respect builds stronger than nails. I ran my hand along the smooth wood and whispered, That's right. As I passed the hallway, I noticed Tasha's door slightly ajar. She was sitting on the floor, a box open beside her. Inside were my old photo albums, the ones she'd packed away weeks ago. She didn't notice me watching. She was looking at a picture of Thomas and me on our wedding day. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. I walked away quietly, my heart heavy and full at once. The next morning, I woke to the smell of pancakes. When I came downstairs, Tasha was at the stove humming the same gospel tune I'd been humming the day before. Marcus sat at the table grinning. Mom, she's trying to outdo you, he teased. I laughed. Let her try. She's younger. Her wrists don't ache yet. Tasha flipped a pancake with a flourish. These might not be perfect, she said, but they're made with respect. Then they'll be the best kind, I replied, sitting down. We ate together, sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. For once there were no sharp words, no hidden glances, just laughter, warmth, and the quiet hum of a house that finally felt whole again. When breakfast was done, Marcus left for work and I started clearing the table. Tasha stopped me. Leave it, she said. I'll handle the dishes. I smiled. You're full of surprises lately. Trying to earn my keep, she said. And maybe a little redemption. Redemption doesn't ask for permission, I said softly. It just shows up when you're ready. She nodded, and I watched her turn back to the sink, sleeves rolled up, sunlight glinting in her hair. Outside, the wind stirred the lavender in the garden, carrying its scent through the open window. The house breathed deeply alive again. And I knew as I leaned against the doorframe that what had been broken wasn't just mended, it was reborn. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang noon. I closed my eyes listening and whispered, "Thank you, Thomas, she's learning." The walls seemed to hum with approval, the kind of quiet grace that fills a home when forgiveness finally takes root. The sky turned gray again by the end of the week, thick clouds rolling in from the coast like a warning. I stood by the kitchen window, drying my hands on a towel, watching the branches sway in the wind. Tasha was on the porch covering the new railing with plastic sheets to protect the fresh paint. The words she'd carved into it, "Respect builds, stronger than nails," gleamed faintly under the afternoon light. I smiled to myself. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home again. Marcus came in from the yard, brushing sawdust off his jeans. "We're all set," he said. "Storm's coming in heavy, but the porch'll hold." "It always does," I said. "Built on stubborn hands." He grinned. "Wonder where I got that from." "Your father," I said. "And maybe a little from me." He kissed my cheek, then disappeared into the living room, calling for Buddy. I turned back to the sink, rinsing the last of the dishes. The rhythm of water and wind felt steady, comforting, until I heard the sound of footsteps at the door. Tasha stood there holding her phone, her expression tight. "Lillian," she said slowly, "there's something I need to tell you before Marcus finds out." I dried my hands and faced her. "All right, go on." She took a deep breath. "It's about the job interview I told you I had next week, the one in Atlanta." "Yes," I said. "You said it was for a communications role." She nodded. "It is. But it's more than that. If I get it, we'll have to move, at least for a while." I felt my chest tighten. "Move? As in leave, Savannah?" Her voice was careful. "Just for a year, maybe 2. It's a good opportunity for Marcus too. The company has openings for project managers and he could apply. We could finally get on our feet again." The wind rattled the window pane behind me. "And what happens to this house?" She swallowed hard. "I thought, maybe you could rent it out. Or, I asked, though I already knew. Or come with us," she said quickly. "Atlanta's only a few hours away. You could stay close. I don't want you here alone." I stared at her, studying her face. Her tone wasn't cruel, it was worried, honest. But still the words felt like tiny cracks splintering through glass. "Tasha," I said quietly, "this house has weathered hurricanes, wars, and funerals. It doesn't crumble because someone leaves." "I know," she said, her eyes pleading. "I just don't want to hurt you." "You won't," I said. "But I won't move either." She nodded slowly, disappointment flickering across her face. "I figured you'd say that." "Then why ask?" "Because Marcus will," she said softly. "And I didn't want you blindsided." I took a deep breath, steadying the air in my lungs. "Thank you for that," I said finally. "You've grown." She gave a small, shaky laugh. "You think so? I know so. You warned me before the storm instead of bringing it to my door." Outside, thunder rumbled low like an old grudge stirring. That evening, the storm hit hard. Rain pounded the roof, and lightning lit the sky in flashes. Marcus stood by the window, watching the trees bend. "Feels like last spring all over again," he said. "Every storm feels the same until it passes," I replied. He looked distracted, hands in his pockets. "Mom, Tasha told you about Atlanta, didn't she?" "She did." He nodded. "It's a good chance for us. I can't keep doing temporary jobs forever. She deserves stability." "And what do you deserve, son?" He hesitated. "Peace, maybe. You won't find that in a different zip code," I said. "Peace isn't about where you are, it's about what you stop running from." He sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You sound like the church ladies again." "They're usually right," I said, smiling faintly. Lightning flashed, followed by a crack of thunder so loud, Buddy whimpered and hid under the table. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out. The house plunged into darkness. Marcus found a flashlight, its beam cutting through the dim. Power's gone. Candles are in the pantry, I said, reaching for the matches. We lit them one by one until the kitchen glowed with soft golden light. The storm outside howled, but inside it felt almost sacred. Tasha joined us, her face pale in the flicker. They said the main line's down, she said. Could take hours. Then we wait, I said, sitting down. Storms always end. For a long while none of us spoke. The rain drummed against the roof, steady and relentless. Then Tasha broke the silence. Lillian, she said, if we do move, I'll make sure you're taken care of. The foundation's safe, right? It's untouchable, I said. Not even a storm can reach it. Her shoulders eased. Good. Marcus turned the flashlight toward me. You did that for security, didn't you? Not for revenge. I nodded. Revenge is loud. Protection is quiet. I've learned to prefer quiet. Tasha smiled softly. That's your kind of strength, isn't it? Quiet, but impossible to move. I looked at her, the flickering light catching the silver glint of her wedding band. It's the only kind that lasts. When the rain began to ease, we stepped onto the porch. The air was cool and wet, the scent of earth heavy in the air. The lavender bowed under the weight of the rain, but none of it was broken. Tasha leaned against the new railing, tracing the carved words with her fingers. I used to think respect was something people owed me, she said. Now I think it's something I owe myself first. I nodded. You can't give what you don't have. Marcus stood between us, looking out into the dark yard. You know, he said softly, Dad used to say storms make the ground stronger after they pass. Maybe that's what this family needed. Maybe it was, I said. The clouds began to thin, moonlight peeking through. The wet wood of the railing glistened silver. Tasha turned to me. I'll go to Atlanta if it happens, but I'll come back, I promise. I know you will, I said. You're not the same woman who threw a blanket on the floor. She laughed quietly. No. That woman didn't know what she had. And now, I asked. Now, she said, I do. We stood there for a while, listening to the rain fade into a whisper. The air was clean, the world washed new. Inside, the candles still flickered in the window, small flames holding steady against the dark. Later, when they'd both gone to bed, I stayed on the porch alone. The sky was clearing fast, stars beginning to pierce the black. I pulled the old blanket around my shoulders, breathing in its lavender scent. Somewhere deep inside, I felt Thomas near, like a quiet voice carried in the wind. You did good, Lil, I imagined him saying. I smiled. We did, I whispered back. The house creaked softly the way it always did, after a storm settling, steadying, remembering. I closed my eyes and let the night wrap around me. Whatever came next, Atlanta distance change, it would come. But this house, this peace, this hard-earned respect would remain. When the first light of dawn touched the porch, the words carved into the wood gleamed again, fresh and strong. Respect builds stronger than nails. I ran my fingers over them one last time and whispered, and stronger than storms. The morning after the storm smelled like renewal, wet grass, fresh air and coffee brewing slow in the kitchen. I sat by the window, my blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching sunlight drip through the trees like gold. The quiet felt heavy but gentle, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. For a few blessed hours the world had stopped shouting. Tasha came down the stairs barefoot, her hair tied in a loose braid. She was holding her phone, biting her lip the way she did when she was nervous. They called, she said softly. I looked up. Atlanta, she nodded. They offered me the job. The words hung between us like the last drop of rain before it falls. I see, I said. She hesitated. I haven't said yes yet. I wanted to talk to Marcus first. To you too. You don't owe me that, I replied gently. It's your life. She stepped closer, setting her phone on the table. It doesn't feel right making a decision that affects everyone without asking the woman who built the ground we're standing on. I studied her face, steady, sincere. You've come a long way from the woman who used to slam doors. She smiled faintly. Guess you rubbed off on me. Before I could answer, the front door opened and Marcus stepped in carrying a bag of groceries. Morning, ladies, he said cheerfully. You two look serious. What'd I miss? Tasha met his eyes. I got the job, Marcus. He froze for a moment. You did, she nodded. It's good money. Great benefits. But it's in Atlanta. The light in his eyes dimmed a little. That's 3 hours away, I know. He set the bag down and leaned against the counter, rubbing the back of his neck. You want to move, don't you? She didn't answer immediately. I want stability, she said finally. We've been chasing it for too long. And what about Mom? He asked. She's here. Tasha looked at me, then back at him. I told her. She says she'll be fine. I will, I said calmly. This house and I have learned to keep each other company. Marcus sighed deeply. I just don't know if uprooting everything again is the answer. I finally feel like things are peaceful. Tasha's voice softened. Peace isn't always stillness, Marcus. Sometimes it's movement. He walked to the window, looking out toward the porch. The carved words on the railing glinted in the light. Respect builds stronger than nails. He turned back to her. Then promise me this, whatever we do next, we don't lose that. I promise, she said. The room fell silent again. Only the faint hum of the fridge and the ticking clock filled the air. I sipped my coffee, letting them have their moment. They were learning the lessons life had taken me decades. To understand every choice cost something, even peace. Later that day, Tasha joined me in the garden. The soil was still damp, soft beneath our feet. She knelt beside me, helping replant the marigolds the storm had flattened. You ever regret staying here all these years? She asked suddenly. I pressed a small root into the ground. No, I said. Regret grows faster than weeds. I don't water it. She chuckled quietly. You always have an answer. I've had time to practice, I said. She dug a small hole, her hands dirty but careful. If I go, I'll miss this, she murmured. The quiet. The smell of the earth after rain. You. I looked over at her. You'll find your own version of it wherever you go. The trick is to carry peace with you, not chase it. She sat back, wiping her forehead. That's harder than it sounds. Everything worth keeping is. That evening, Marcus grilled dinner out back, the air thick with the scent of charcoal and rosemary. The three of us ate together on the porch, the sun bleeding orange into the horizon. For once there were no unspoken grudges, no waiting storms. Just laughter, the clink of forks, and the sound of Buddy snoring under the table. When we finished eating, Marcus leaned back in his chair. So I was thinking, he said, if you take the job, maybe I'll commute for a while. Split time between Atlanta and here. I can handle the drive until we figure things out. Tasha looked surprised. You'd do that, he nodded. You've followed me before. Maybe it's my turn to follow you. She blinked, her eyes glistening. I don't deserve you. He reached for her hand. You do now. I smiled quietly, feeling something warm settle in my chest. They had fought for their peace, stumbled and bled for it. Maybe this was what love looked like once it stopped being young, tired, but willing. When the dishes were cleared, I stayed behind on the porch. The sky had deepened into blue, fireflies flickering near the hedges. Tasha came back out carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed me one, then sat beside me. I talked to the hiring manager again, she said softly. They said I could start remote for the first few months. Maybe we don't have to rush anything. That sounds wise, I said. Rushing ruins more than it fixes. She sipped her tea, then smiled. You really are the calm in every storm, you know, that I laughed. Calm isn't natural. It's earned. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the cicadas hum. Then she said, you know, when I threw your blanket on the floor that night, I thought I was proving something. I thought I was claiming space. But all I did was lose my own dignity. I turned my head toward her. And what have you learned since then? She exhaled slowly. That dignity isn't about who wins, it's about who refuses to stop showing grace. I smiled faintly. Sounds like you've been listening. She laughed softly. To the right person this time. The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the garden. I thought of Thomas again, his voice steady in memory. Respect isn't demanded, Lil, it's demonstrated. Tasha leaned her head back against the chair. If I take the job, I want to use what I've learned here. Maybe start something for women at work, a mentorship or a resource program. Something that gives them what the foundation gave me. That's a good idea, I said. Pay it forward. She nodded. You know, I never understood why you named it Respect House until now. Because I built it from what people tried to take from me, I said. My voice. My value. My home. I turned it into something no one could destroy. She looked at me with something like awe. You really did that. I did, I said softly. And now it's your turn to build your own. A gust of wind swept across the porch, rustling the curtains. She reached for the blanket folded beside me and draped it over my lap. Still smells like lavender, she said. It's supposed to, I replied. That scent kept me sane through worse storms than this. She smiled. You think we'll be okay? I know we will, I said. Because you finally learned the hardest lesson. She tilted her head. Which one? That respect doesn't start with others. It starts when you stop disrespecting yourself. Her eyes softened. Thank you, Lillian. For not giving up on me. I looked at her and said, oh, I wanted to plenty of times. But Grace kept me busy. We both laughed, the sound gentle in the night. The porch light flickered, catching the words on the railing once more. Respect builds stronger than nails. Tasha traced the letters again, whispering, and stronger than pride. I sipped my tea, smiling into the quiet. Amen to that. Inside, I heard Marcus moving about, humming low. The smell of fresh wood still lingered in the air, mingling with the lavender from the garden. For the first time in years, everything in the house, the walls, the floor, the people, seemed to breathe in unison. Peace had stopped feeling fragile, it felt earned. And as the night deepened around us, I whispered to the wind, Thomas, she's ready now. The leaves rustled softly in reply, and I knew some storms don't end in thunder. They end in understanding. The morning light poured into the kitchen like honey, soft and golden. I stood by the counter folding a clean stack of linens when I heard a knock at the door. It was early, too early for visitors, and for a fleeting moment my heart tightened with that familiar worry that never quite fades even in peace. But when I opened the door, it wasn't trouble standing there, it was Grace. She hadn't changed much since I last saw her, maybe a little more silver in her hair, a few new lines around her mouth, but her eyes were still sharp and kind. You're a hard woman to find, Lillian Harper, she said, stepping inside with that steady air of purpose she always carried. Grace Whitmore, I said, smiling. I should have known that knock belonged to a lawyer. She laughed softly and held up a folder. You're not in trouble, I promise. But I thought you might want to hear something that'll make your morning brighter. I gestured toward the table. Coffee's fresh. Start with that. Once she was settled, she slid the folder across to me. It's official, she said. Respect House just received state recognition for its outreach work. They're naming your foundation one of the model programs for senior protection initiatives. For a moment I just stared at the words on the page. It felt surreal, something I'd built out of fear and pain, now being celebrated as hope. Grace, I said quietly, I didn't build it for awards. I know, she replied. That's why it deserves one. I folded my hands over the papers, my fingers trembling slightly. I just wanted women like me to feel safe, to not be invisible. And now, she said, you've made sure they never will be again. Before I could answer, Tasha came down the hallway, still tying her robe. Morning, she said, pausing when she saw Grace. Oh, hi, I didn't realize we had company. Grace, this is my daughter-in-law, Tasha. The one who's been keeping me in line lately. Grace stood and extended a hand. So you're the one I've been hearing about. Tasha shook it nervously. I hope it was good. Grace smiled. It was honest. We all sat at the table. Grace explained that the state board wanted to expand the foundation, more partnerships, more funding, maybe even a regional office in Atlanta. Tasha's eyes lit up when she heard that. Atlanta, she asked. Yes, Grace said. They're hoping to recruit a co-director who understands both the legal and personal side of these issues. Lillian's recommended you. Tasha froze. Me, I nodded slowly. You've been doing the work already, just without the title. Her voice wavered. Lillian, are you sure? I'm sure, I said. You've walked through both sides of what we fight for. You know what loss feels like, what redemption costs. That makes you more qualified than anyone. Grace leaned forward. The board meets next month. If you're willing, we can start preparing your file. Tasha blinked rapidly, tears welling. I don't know what to say. Say yes, I told her gently. She let out a shaky laugh. Then yes. When Grace left an hour later, the house felt brighter somehow. Tasha stood by the door, holding the folder like it was fragile glass. I don't deserve this, she murmured. Then earn it, I said. That's how grace works. That evening we celebrated the only way we knew how simple and heartfelt. Marcus grilled out back. Lena helped set the table, and Tasha made cornbread from my old recipe. The air smelled of summer, and smoke and laughter came easier than it used to. At dinner, Marcus raised his glass. "To my wife, the new co-director of Respect House," he said proudly. Tasha blushed. "Not official yet." "Close enough," I said, clinking my glass against hers. "You've already done the hard part, changing yourself." She smiled, her eyes shining with something that looked like peace. After dinner, while the others cleaned up, I slipped out to the porch with my tea. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas. I could hear faint laughter from inside, the kind that lives deep in a house's bones and keeps it alive. Tasha joined me after a few minutes, carrying a plate of peach cobbler. "You didn't get dessert," she said, setting it beside me. "Didn't think I'd earned it yet." "You built an empire out of compassion," she said softly. "If anyone's earned cobbler, it's you." I laughed quietly. "That might be the sweetest thing you've ever said to me." She smiled. "Don't get used to it." We ate in silence for a while, the sound of the crickets filling the gaps. Then she spoke again. "I've been thinking a lot about what respect really means. At first, I thought it was about hierarchy, who gets to be right. But now I think it's about understanding someone's pain and not adding to it." I looked at her proud. "Then you've learned more than most people ever do." She exhaled slowly. "I just wish I'd learned it before I broke so much." "Broken things can still be beautiful," I said. "You've seen my porch, haven't you?" That made her laugh, deep real laughter that reached her eyes. "You're impossible," she said. "And you're forgiven," I replied. Her laughter stopped, but her smile stayed. She looked at me with tears glimmering in her eyes. "That means more than you know." "I know," I said softly. "That's why I said it." Inside, I could hear Marcus playing an old record. Sam Cooke's voice floated through the open window. "A change is gonna come." The sound of it wrapped around us, tender and sure. Tasha leaned back in her chair, looking out at the yard. "You think people like us can really change the world, one piece at a time," I said. "The world doesn't shift all at once, it tilts slowly toward those who care enough to push." She nodded, her gaze distant. "Then I guess it's time to start pushing." Later that night, after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table writing in my journal. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. I wrote about Grace's visit, about Tasha's new beginning, about how forgiveness felt more like a bridge than an ending. Then at the bottom of the page I wrote something I hadn't realized until that very moment. I used to believe respect had to be demanded. Now I know it only grows where love is tended. This house taught me that. So did she. I closed the journal, letting my hand rest on the cover. The silence around me wasn't empty anymore, it was alive, filled with every lesson, every scar, every prayer whispered into the walls. Outside, the moon rose, high silver and unshaken. I could feel Thomas in that stillness, the way I always did when I'd done something right. "You were right again, old man," I whispered. "Respect isn't a gift, it's a garden." And as the night deepened, I thought of the women who would one day find refuge in the homes. We'd protect the ones who'd sit at their kitchen tables just like this, holding papers that proved no one could take their peace again. That was the legacy I'd built, not revenge, not defiance, but restoration. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at rest. The sun was low in the sky, spilling soft amber light through the lace curtains as I sat on the porch with my old journal open in my lap. The pages fluttered in the breeze, their edges worn and yellowed from years of being open to the same lessons. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't an empty quiet, it was the kind filled with life humming in every corner. Marcus's laughter drifted from inside, where he and Lena were baking cookies, and I could hear Tasha's voice from the backyard, steady and warm, guiding a small group of volunteers as they loaded donation boxes into a van marked Respect House Foundation. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. There had been a time when that name was just an idea scribbled in grief. Now it was painted on vans, printed on banners, and whispered like hope in church basements and women's shelters all across Georgia. What once started as a defense had become a promise. The screen door creaked open and Tasha stepped out, wiping her hands on a rag. "We're heading out to the center," she said. Want to come along? I looked up at her, her confident posture, her kind eyes, the faint streak of paint still smudged on her cheek. I think I'll sit this one out, I said. You've got it handled. She hesitated. Are you sure, child? I said with a grin. You run a whole foundation now. I think you can manage a van full of blankets. She laughed. You'll never stop teasing me about that night, will you? Not as long as I'm breathing, I replied. That blanket turned out to be the best lesson either of us ever got. Her laughter softened and she nodded. It really did. When she drove away, I stayed on the porch, watching the dust rise on the old road until the van disappeared. Then I looked down at my journal and wrote, "Forgiveness is not forgetting, it's remembering without bitterness. It's turning pain into purpose." The wind stirred again, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden. I stood and walked down the steps, my knees protesting just enough to remind me that time had done its work. The marigolds we'd replanted months ago were blooming bright orange against the green. I knelt beside them, pressing my fingers into the soil. The earth was warm, forgiving. When I straightened, I saw Marcus walking toward me, Lena skipping beside him, her curly hair bouncing with each step. She held something small in her hands. "Grandma," she called. "Look what we made." She opened her palms to reveal a small wooden plaque painted sky blue with gold letters carved across it. "Respect begins at home." I felt tears prick my eyes before I could stop them. "It's beautiful," I said softly. Marcus smiled. "She wanted to hang it by the front door. Said it should be the first thing people see. That's exactly where it belongs." Lena beamed. "It's for you, Grandma. Because you started it." I crouched and pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and sunshine. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "We all started it. I just made sure no one stopped it." We hung the plaque together that afternoon. The hammer felt heavy in my hands, but when the last nail went in, I stepped back and looked at it proudly. The light from the porch reflected off the gold letters, glowing like a quiet flame. As evening settled, the volunteers returned. Tasha walked up the steps, her face tired but bright. "It was a good turnout," she said, dropping into the chair beside me. "We helped 3 new families apply for housing protection. One of them cried when she found out she wouldn't lose her home. I handed her a glass of sweet tea. Now you know what purpose feels like." She took a sip and exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I do." For a moment we sat in silence, watching the light fade from gold to violet. Then she turned to me. "Do you ever think about that first night when I threw the blanket?" "I think about it," I said. "But not the way you do. I don't see the anger anymore. I see the turning point." She nodded, her voice quiet. "I'm sorry it had to happen like that." "I'm not," I said gently. "You don't learn respect from comfort. You learn it when something breaks and you have to decide what to rebuild." She blinked back tears. "You rebuilt me." "No," I said. "You rebuilt yourself." I just left the door open. From inside, Lena called for her mother. Tasha smiled, stood and turned toward the door. "She wants to show me her homework. I'll be back out soon." "Go on," I said. "Duty calls." As the house filled again with the sounds of family pots, clanging laughter echoing, I leaned back and looked out toward the garden. The roses Thomas had planted were glowing in the twilight, each petal tipped with light. I could almost hear his voice in the hush between the crickets. "You did good, Lil. You made it mean something." "I hope so," I whispered. "I really hope so." Later that night, after the house had gone still, Tasha joined me again on the porch. She brought the old blanket folded neatly in her arms. "Thought you might want this," she said. I took it from her, smoothing my hands over the fabric. It was soft, freshly washed, smelling faintly of lavender. "It's seen a lot, hasn't it?" "It has," she said. "So have we." I smiled. "Funny thing about blankets, they're meant to cover, not divide." She sat beside me, pulling the edge of it over her lap. "Then let's share it." The moon hung high, silver, and steady. We sat like that for a while, 2 women bound not by blood but by forgiveness, warmth, and the long road that led us here. Tasha broke the silence first. "They want us to record a short video for the Foundation's website," she said. "You know, to tell our story, maybe inspire others." "Oh Lord," I said, chuckling. "They don't need to see my wrinkles to believe in redemption." She laughed. "It's not about wrinkles. It's about truth. You always said, respect starts when you tell the truth." I sighed, then smiled. All right then. We'll do it tomorrow. The next afternoon, we filmed the video right on the porch. The camera sat on a tripod facing us, the garden blooming behind. I didn't read from notes, I just spoke the way I always did, with heart. When my son's wife moved in after he lost his job, I said into the lens, I thought I was opening my home. I didn't realize I was opening a lesson. Respect isn't about control or fear. It's about seeing each other's worth, even when we forget our own. Tasha added softly. Sometimes you have to be broken before you can understand what dignity means. I threw away kindness once, but love threw me a lifeline. We smiled at each other. I looked into the camera again. If this story reached you, hold it close. Share it with someone who needs to remember that redemption isn't weakness, it's strength reborn. When the recording ended, Tasha's hand brushed mine. You really have a way with words, you know. I've had a lot of practice, I said. Mostly in silence. That evening we uploaded the video to the Foundation's page. Within hours, messages started pouring in. Women from across the country wrote about their own stories, mothers, daughters, widows, grandmothers, each one finding a piece of themselves in ours. Some thanked us for hope. Others simply said, I'm not alone anymore. I read them until my eyes blurred. Then I closed the laptop and whispered, that's enough for one life. The porch was quiet again. The plaque by the door caught the moonlight. Respect begins at home. The house glowed faintly through the windows, full of laughter and light. I leaned back in my chair, the blanket draped across my knees, Buddy curled at my feet. Thomas, I said softly, you'd be proud. We turned our storm into a sanctuary. The wind stirred the marigolds, carrying their scent across the porch. Somewhere inside, Lena laughed, a high, clear sound that made the house feel eternal. And as I closed my eyes, I felt peace, not the fragile kind that trembles, but the kind that endures. To anyone listening, to anyone watching this story, I'd tell them what life finally taught me. Dignity isn't given by others. It's built with kindness, guarded by truth, and reclaimed by courage. If this story spoke to your heart, share it. Tell someone who needs to hear that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems it. Leave a comment, let me know what respect means to you. Because every story of grace deserves to be remembered.